All right, greetings. What's up, world? Welcome to this special edition. I guess I'll call it I Mix What I Like, but a special edition for Morgan State University in particular, and the School of Global Journalism and Communication, where I am currently a full professor of communication studies. Again, my name is Jared Ball. Happy to be playing host for this exciting conversation. For more on what I do and for more on this conversation, you can follow us at imixwhatilike.org or at imixwhatilike for all your relevant social media. And with that, let me turn to our very special guest, who many of you, I'm sure, will know by now, Dr. Darrick Hamilton, who is one of the country's leading economists examining racial disparity and will rejoin the New School on January 1st of 2021 as the Henry Cohen Professor.
Let me give a quick correction.
Oh, please.
I'm already at the New School, so what you're about to say is happening.
It's already happening. He is the Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Urban Policy and a university professor. Hamilton is serving as the founding director of the newly created Institute for the Study of Race, Stratification, and Political Economy at the New School. The Institute is going to advance research, policy, and conversation regarding the iterative interactions of race, stratification, and political economy. In particular, the Institute will confront the pressing issues of our time and develop pathways and policies that break down hierarchy and help move society towards greater equity, inclusion, and civic participation. Hamilton, of course, is a pioneer and internationally recognized scholar in the field of stratification economics, which fuses insights from multiple disciplines to challenge and expand orthodox economic interpretation as they relate to identity formation, collective group action, inequality, and group-based distributions. He has been a vocal proponent of policy solutions related to economic health and education outcomes. Hamilton himself was born and raised in the Bedford-Stuyvesant section of Brooklyn, New York. He is a graduate of Oberlin College and earned a PhD in economics from the University of North Carolina. He completed postdoctoral appointments at the University of Michigan and Yale University, respectively. Hamilton's op-ed pieces have appeared in various prestigious periodicals, including the New York Times, Bloomberg's Business Week, Market Watch, and many others. And he is frequently interviewed by media outlets, including the Washington Post, The Atlantic, and MSNBC and NPR, which is, of course, a lot of what we want to talk with him about today. Professor Hamilton, thanks again for joining us and welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So I have, just so folks are aware, I have a set of questions that I have prepared for Professor Hamilton, and then we're going to invite you all to participate. Please, if you would like, as many of you have already started doing, put your questions in the Ask a Question section down below at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to as many as we can. I do not intend to dominate the conversation, and looking forward to hearing as much as we can from Professor Hamilton and have him engage with all of us, including our students, faculty, and staff. So Professor Hamilton, before I do ask those questions, did you want to add to your introduction there and give maybe some depth and background to the work that you do or are currently doing before we move on?
So, I could do one or two things, and I'm going to let you be the captain of this ship. I could frame a conversation about where we are, our context, and what we could do to get out of this. Maybe go about 5 minutes or so, 6 minutes, and go from there or not. It's up.
No, that's perfect because in fact, so it's perfect because I'll just ask my first question. How would you describe the current state of economic affairs for Black America, and what might you suggest we start doing, if not already engaged in it, to get out of it?
Yeah, well, that leads right in. All right, we need new policies and policy frameworks that ensure widespread economic security, period. Our despair and disparity is dramatic, and changes at the margin won't cut it. To reverse decades and generations of poverty, discrimination, and economic and political concentration at the top, we need a bold overhaul of our laws and our economy. We are faced with a choice. One, we can continue down a path of deregulation, lower taxes on the wealthy, a gutting of government services and social welfare programs, or make a profound change towards a more sustainable, moral economy with government interventions to facilitate assets, economic security, engagement, human dignity, and social mobility for all its citizens, regardless of their race, class, gender, or sexual orientation. This past summer, we've seen a wave of protests in response to law enforcement and so-called vigilante racialized killings of Black people. The protests haven't been seen on scale, at least since the Civil Rights era in the 1950s and 60s. We've also witnessed the coronavirus pandemic, which has triggered the loss of more than, I think now the number's at 225,000 American lives. And also more than 50 million Americans applying for unemployment. The pandemic reveals our collective public health and economic vulnerability, but also in plain sight is a peculiar racial vulnerability in which Black people are more than twice as likely to die from the virus. And also 45%, nearly half of Black-owned businesses have already closed as a result of this pandemic. With Blacks making up about 13% of our US population and over 200,000 COVID-related deaths to date, that would suggest that we've already lost in excess of 50,000 Black lives, with at least 25,000 of them not occurring if we had a political economy that treated Blacks and whites the same. So you can think of those as 25,000 surplus, or a surplus of death that wouldn't take place without our racist structure. That the impact of something presumably random, such as a pandemic, however catastrophic, that is so linked to one's racial identity, it's indicative of an economy that's failing. It links to a larger political and economic vulnerability for Black Americans, whether we're in a pandemic or not. The immoral devaluation of Black lives has been ingrained into the American political economy, and it's obviously and long overdue for a reckoning. Many Black and brown families have low wealth, which is also something we're all well aware of, inadequate health care, and we work in precarious but now essential jobs that have fewer workplace protections, lower wages, and vulnerability and without some of the benefits that might protect you. We know wealth impacts the ability to respond to a pandemic. It provides security in an emergency. And this crisis will only exacerbate our unjust racial wealth gap that leaves Blacks and low asset communities vulnerable. Right now, what we should be doing is everything to protect our public health and to keep workers, including gig workers and micro businesses, keep them intact and keep aggregate demand in place or higher. And we need to establish the building blocks for a transformative, secure, inclusive, and more equitable economy so that we will be less vulnerable to the next pandemic, climate-related catastrophes, as well as the everyday vulnerabilities that most of us live with. We can say with certainty, based on recent history and economic downturns and our current economic structures, that the aftermath of this pandemic is going to result in greater inequality and despair. That is, unless government does something to change this reality. For the last 45 years, we've pursued supply-side trickle-down economics, and it's never come. The trickle-down has never come to fruition. What we do, our current political economy has radically situated the market, and I put that in quotes because a market is a political construction, as the great, efficient, self-regulating, colorblind arbiter of our worth and the solution for all our problems, economic or otherwise. And stigmatization based on race and anti-Blackness have been strategically used as the political fodder to implement harsh and punitive control on the underclass. Blacks have become the symbolism of undeserving welfare queens, deadbeat dads, super predators, by which we're able to define a surplus population and tolerate that 25,000 excess death that I referred to in the beginning. As a result, our policy infrastructures are state and federal interventions, as well as public-private partnerships that attempt to leverage private and charitable resources to manage and incentivize so-called defective Black and brown people to get an education and become more employable. This framing is derived from a cultural poverty thesis in which Blacks are presumed to undervalue and have a low acquisition of education. The framing is wrong, the directional emphasis is wrong, it is more likely that meager economic circumstance, not poor decision-making or deficient knowledge, that economic circumstance constrains choice itself and leaves poor people with little to no other financial options but to attain and use predatory and abusive financial services. We're not atomistic agents floating in unfettered markets guided by a free will into fair and efficient allocation. We should do a better job of understanding the roles of power, the roles of capital, and how our political economy can be used and manipulated by power and capital to facilitate transaction for those that have power in the first place. We should be more focused on understanding and advocating for structures that lead to fairer and equitable distributions. Power and capital are self-reinforcing, and without intervention, they do what they do best, which is they iterate and generate cycles of stratification and inequality. Authentic agency is grounded in resources. There are a set of enabling goods and services that are so critical for individual life, liberty, and self-determination that their quantity, their quality, and access to them should not be vulnerable to the pricing and rationing that come about from firms trying to meet profit maximization fiduciary responsibilities to their shareholders. We need policies with public options that directly compete with and crowd out inferior private options that do not ensure universal and quality health care, housing, schooling, financial services, capital, and the free mobility throughout society without the psychological and physical threat of detention or bodily harm at the hands of a state-sanctioned terror because someone's identity is linked to a vulnerable or stigmatized group. We need to reject the empirically unsubstantiated rhetoric and even racist rhetoric that ignorant so-called grit and personal responsibility are the sources of inequality, along with that accompanying neoliberal paternalism in which government attempts to coerce or incentivize insinuated defective people to behave accordingly and make better decisions. What we need is bold, transformative, anti-racist, anti-sexist policies that by design and implementation are intentionally inclusive of all racial, ethnic, and gender groups. And then, of course, we could talk about reparations as well, which is something you and I both know is necessary if we're ever going to get beyond our race problem in America.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Professor Hamilton, for that introductory statement and overview. I've already written down so many other questions, but because I see a number of questions already coming in from our audience, and I think even a few from our students, I want to quickly move to them after this one follow-up from what you just said, and then I'll try to work in my own other questions as we go. But you ended there by making reference to reparations, and I am wondering, as popular as that term at least is discussed, it takes on a lot of different meanings. Has for a lot of different people. So I'm wondering what form of reparations. I know obviously you've talked about baby bonds, et cetera, but what form of reparations how do you define reparations, and what form do you think it should take? And what policy or set of policies should we either develop or support to push that project along?
And just to be clear, baby bonds and reparations aren't the same thing.
Right.
I think both necessary. One is retrospective, the other is prospective. And if we're ever going to have justice in perpetuity, I think we need both. On the one hand, even if we were to implement a full-throated reparations program, given that it would be intended to be finite and retrospective, as I mentioned, capital consolidates and iterates, so we're going to need something prospectively also, even with baby bonds. And if we were to do baby bonds without reparations, I think this is going to get into answering your question, we would not have had that truth and reconciliation. We would have not had that acknowledgement of our sordid path of exploitation, extraction of Black people and Black people resources, which is necessary not only for dignity within Black people, but to have an honest American ethos system so that we can address poverty more broadly. If we were to really grapple with our past, we would understand that it's not individual deficit behaviors that's driving inequality, but resource deprivation. And that would impact our solutions going forward. So that's necessary. And then it's empty if there's no redress. So if you just had the Truth and Reconciliation, perhaps South Africa is somewhat of an example. They did the Truth and Reconciliation, but there's still gross inequities because they didn't really do the redress. But the Truth and Reconciliation wasn't trivial. It probably facilitated at least somewhat of a nonviolent transition. All that's debatable. But anyway, so I'm sorry if I'm long-winded. Let me put a button on this part because I know you got lots of questions.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
The form of redress can be multiple. Some people say write a check, and I'm not opposed to a check because of all the paternalism that we mentioned in the past about Black people mismanaging. I think that's all BS. But the critique of a check is that Black people don't own the means of production in America, nor do they own the land in America. So you could end up with a scenario where you generate a multiplier effect for those that have capital in a way that ironically benefits them. So the way a multiplier effect works is if I give you $1,000 and you save 900, you spend 900, your income went up by 1,000. The next person you gave $900 to, their income went up by 900. They'll turn around and give 90% of that. The next person's income goes up by 90% of that 900. So it generates an iterative impact on income that multiplies throughout an economy. And if you don't own the means of production, then you don't benefit from that multiplier effect. So I believe that reparations has to include some form of assets as well, where literally Black people could get transfers of ownership within corporations. You can buy stocks and transfer them. Government could buy stocks and literally transfer them as part of a reparations program. But I've been talking about individual assets. There are also community assets. So you can invest in Black institutions. You can generate trusts. But the key point to me is that there has to be some ownership and something that promotes perpetuity. So it's not a one-time transfer, something that will offer a return that will be, ongoing.
I do have to ask this one other question before we get to the other ones, just broadly speaking, because in part in response to something you said, but I think it will help set the context properly. On the one hand, you said in your introductory statement that that markets are political constructions. And could you expand on that in the context of this question of what role public policy plays in economic policy or the process of the economy? So when at your work at the New School, you're working on political economy, and many of us smile when we hear that phrase. This separation of politics and economics doesn't work, and it has to be understood as a political economy. So I just what role does policy play in economics?
Right. You know me well enough that I try to use provocative terms and use labels intentionally. So I meant to be provocative by saying markets, and I'm not the first. Somebody, big shout out to the president of Demos. That's who I heard say it first.
Okay.
I was like, you smart.
It's true. I mean, it's accurate. Yeah.
Even a farmer's market. So the classic textbook example we give as a professor in economics is, a farmer's market. Everybody has apples that are indistinguishable. I won't get into all the details, but even that market, which we use as a classic market, is a political construction. Somebody had to get a permit to be able to sell their wares at your local farmer's market. So, that's a political construction. But that's why I said it to be provocative, is that the discipline of economics in its current modern formation, what we might call neoclassical economics or orthodox economics, presents itself as a science in a way that leads us to not question the assumptions, not question the conclusions, as if it's natural and inevitable. And that's why I'm trying to make the point that nothing is natural or inevitable, that even what we define as a market, we have choice in political agency in defining how they operate. What is good and bad about our discipline is the mathematics behind it. What does math do? Math forces you to be able to have a coherent logic. And I'm not saying, there are narrative models that are good too. So I'm not trying to make that juxtaposition, but a benefit of a mathematical model is it really forces you to go through the rigor and have a coherent logic. The limitations, and there are probably others, is that it's very limited. What you can do with math does not allow levels of nuance that is part of the reality that we have. And they often begin with a set of assumptions that you needed in order to draw the mathematical formulations that we generate, as well as the conclusions that come about from math. And we don't spend a whole lot of time talking about the presumptions that we led with to begin with in order to get to some of the outcomes that the eloquent beauty of math could generate.
Right on. Even as someone who struggles on the other side of that divide, I appreciate what you've said. Look, the very first question we have here is something I wanted to address with you, admittedly somewhat differently. The question is about Ice Cube and his contract with Black America. And I definitely wanted to ask you about not only that specifically, but in general, maybe the role of celebrity in these conversations, and of course, the role that media play as an even broader context for these conversations. As someone who engages a lot of mainstream or commercial press, I'm very interested in your thoughts on that. But specifically, and I'll just read this question as it's written here: will Professor Darrick Hamilton do a deep dive into the economic portion of Ice Cube's contract with Black America? So much of the discussion has been around Ice Cube and not what's actually in it, which doesn't appear to be very good. And after you respond, I again am interested in this context that the media play even in relationship to this issue here. But yeah, what do you think about Cube and his contract?
And if I forget, because of my feeble mind, I can't remember all the questions. If I forget the answer part, please remind me.
Sure.
Attempt to skate, just trying to keep my thoughts together. So the first part about what's in it, I thought it was written very well. I thought it was written well enough that I was willing to write the preface for it. So, I guess I disagree about what was in it as being inadequate. I thought it could have been from any old think tank that one comes up with when they generate these type of policies. Admittedly, it's, I guess, why am I saying admittedly? It's not a perfect document. So I wouldn't say that. And there are probably some things in there I would critique as well. But in whole, in its totality, I think it's a useful, well-written document.
And for those of us who may not know the details, can you tell us a little bit about what's in it that you think makes it good? And then maybe we can invite the question, whoever asked that, to add another question about what they might think is bad, and we can come back to that later. But what do you think that's in it that is of value?
So a couple of things. One is, let me even add that the contract's been out for a long time. So it came out in like either late June, early July, or something like that. So in earnest, I have not, and people might think this is a skate, but in truth, I have not looked at it in much detail since the time I read it back then. So I'm going a little bit off of memory. But what I remember is it addressed it had things in there that provided for some of the assets that I've been talking about. Like, I believe they had in there something around debt-free college education, the right to a college degree. So that's in line with the economic rights platform that I led off with when I was describing that. So what does that do? Not only does it ensure that any Black person that wants to go to college, or any person in America that wants to go to college, is not sorted away from college because they lack the resources to pay for college, but it also removes the stigma and burden of finance at the point of delivery of that college. You know, I'll riff a little bit on this and get back to it. You and I, as college professors, probably know who the financial aid students are, not with perfection, not like we get a report, but oftentimes they're clues and signals, and it would be naive to think that university systems don't treat people differently based on ability to pay or status based on financial aid status, et cetera. So what I like about that program, now he didn't go into details about this. This is me from my perspective. But what I like about debt-free college education is that it removes not only that burden of finance, but that stigma that goes along with it. So I like that. What else? The program talked about a need to address the fact that Black people don't have capital. So they endorse baby bonds in there. They have provisions in there that frame Black-white inequality as a problem of capital endowment and put forth some solutions to address it. They have some political statements in there as well, such as a full-throated, I keep using the word full-throated, got to expand my vocabulary, as well as characterizing the KKK as a terrorist organization. So they recognize that, at least in the document, that there's not just economics, there's some politics, some narrative as well. But again, I don't remember the whole document.
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems that I had with the whole discussion around Cube is that a lot of the backlash that I feel like he's getting is more about defending the Democratic Party from criticism, because a lot of what he's saying, at least publicly now, is that his concern is that the Democratic Party hasn't done enough, and that's why he was willing to at least talk to Trump, or because Trump was willing to talk to him. And so a lot of the media backlash, admittedly, is which is beholden to the Democratic Party. I mean, the Pew study that came in recently showed that what was it, MSNBC and Fox have almost full constituencies that are Democratic and Republican respectively. So they're not even talking to one another. So MSNBC or somebody else, who is CNN, when they're criticizing him, or even Roland Martin, when they're criticizing him, I feel like it's got more to do with defending the Democrats and Biden and their particular media space than it is about actually addressing what he's saying or why Cube would have reached that conclusion. So anyway, I just put that out there. You feel free to respond or not, but I think that's at least part of what I read into the question, because when I see it being asked and when it comes up, is why is Cube seemingly siding with Trump? And I think that while it's understandable people would be critical of that it's an unfair and kind of, it's unfair, especially when we always ask celebrities to speak up. So that was also part of the question I wanted to ask you is what do you think about him being a celebrity, and what role celebrity play, and anything about what I've just said, or a response to what I've just said is fine. If not, we can, just keep it moving.
I mean, look, even just thinking about the media, you said that the media gave a narrative that Cube is siding with Trump.
Correct.
That's bullshit. I'm saying not what you accurately describe the media, but it's a bullshit narrative.
Right.
And I'm sorry for using profanity or curse words. But that is exactly part of the issue. That even when media has more nuanced story, the headline itself will be something that akin to what you just described. And most of the people aren't reading the articles. We have, our society today, we look at the article and think we get the gist of it and keep it moving. And nothing he did indicates siding with Trump. You may even be critical of his tactics and say he shouldn't even be conversing with the Trump team. That's fair. I'll say Personally, I wouldn't try to negotiate with I wouldn't say I wouldn't try to negotiate with Republicans or have conversations with Republicans, but definitely not Trump. That, to me, there's something of an aberration, that the man is a con artist, he's untrustworthy, and he's immoral. So there's no win I see with Donald Trump, and I need to have humility also to know that if others make a different choice, like Cube and his team, that Cube's been doing this a long time. He's not Johnny come lately. He's been, he's had a long career and not fairly, but a successful career in many domains and many things. And to some extent, he may be doing things I don't understand at this point. Right now, in hindsight, I can come up with new narratives of how what he did can be productive. But, I'm not going to act like I anticipated that and knew that. I guess what I'm trying to get to in this ramble is I know he's grounded in integrity. I know his goals and desires are to make for a more just society where Black people aren't excluded. And I have the humility to know that as long as he has information, he has his methods and approaches, and I might not always agree, and I may agree, and I'm allowed to be critical. But it is important to know where he's coming from. And then, I'll say the other part, because this relates to the celebrity part. Just like all media, because you're media to some extent, and all these critiques I might have on these profit-driven media infrastructures that benefit from controversy and benefit from closed presidential races, and will do things to as it fits for their own benefit. I don't think you're driven by that. Matter of fact, I know you're not. I know you're grounded in justice and morality also. I know this. And I may not always agree with you, but it's important for me to know that that's where you're coming from. And that makes a difference. Trump is not coming from that perspective, which is why I would make a different choice and never, I see it as a no-win situation. But that said, we could talk about Biden as well, right? So we could talk. I want to do no harm in this election, but Biden's history. That speech he gave on the Senate floor for the crime bill was reprehensible. I didn't see the ABC town hall, but I believe he mentioned some problem with that speech. I didn't see it, but I heard that, so that's good. And I'm going on tangents. I promise to stop in a second.
You're fine.
Talk about what it means for we talked about reparations, but what would it mean for a politician to apologize? What's an authentic apology from a politician? Because people make mistakes, and if we don't allow for the ability for people to learn and overcome their mistakes, then that's not good for us either. So I think a question for us could be, what is an authentic apology? And what would it mean? How would we know that it actually took place? But the last thing about celebrity that I was trying to make, last point, is that celebrity itself is not a homogenous category. So I guess what I'm trying to emphasize is that in various walks of life, people can approach things out of greed, out of narcissism, out of self-interest, but then you also have people that might be more grounded in solidarity, morality, and justice. And people from various walks of life have various parts to play. So, Ice Cube's celebrity has earned him, I won't even say afforded him, has earned him a platform that me as an academic don't have and won't have. And, that's not envy. That's recognition of their society and skills and stuff that he's put in. So, I welcome celebrities grounded in justice that are trying to make a difference in this world, and hope that I can do things to encourage and help that.
Right on. Well, I've always thought it's misunderstood when people say that celebrities need to do this and that, and then are condemned when they do this or that, especially when historically, as the references are often made, celebrities of the past had more robust political movements and social movements to glom onto or to be inspired by. So if we're critical of Ice Cube or anyone else, I think those of us who consider ourselves activists or political actors of some kind, we need to do more work in our area to make room for them to find a quote unquote better home. So where I might be critical of some of the choices of an Ice Cube or anyone else, I always go back to think, well, I would like for people like me to have done better to produce a political movement for him to be attracted to, as opposed to going in maybe some other direction. But so I certainly appreciate what you had to say there as well. Let me move on here and grab another question from our audience, which is, what are some economic policies that can realistically be passed in Congress that will have an immediate impact on Black people in particular? I think you mentioned some of them, and maybe if you could, in the context of that answer, expand a little bit on your point about baby bonds, which I know you have elsewhere, but we haven't talked about in detail here. But what policies can be, quote unquote, realistically developed that will help Black people in particular?
I think they all can be realistically developed and implemented. You know, when I say tuition-free college education, when I say Medicare for all, when I say baby bonds, hell, reparations is almost, HR 40 has almost become the platform for the Democratic Party, if not explicitly. When they all were asked, all the presidential candidates, none of them would say that, hardly any of them would say they were not for HR 40. Eventually, they got there because of pressure and political movements. And this makes the point. There was outside pressure that pushed them there. Now, we can still be critical.
But forgive the interruption. That's just calls for a study. That doesn't actually implement any reparations plan.
I was about to get to that.
Sorry. So sorry.
There's limitations to HR 40, which you just described. But, you know, and one even might argue that even the bill as constructed and defining what the study will consist of is limited also. But nonetheless, if the United States is at the point of having a conversation about HR 40, that's dramatic change from 2008 when Barack Obama was first running and we couldn't even talk about race in public stratosphere. Or 2016 has been dramatic change. So that's progress. That was my only point in making that point. But, you know, to get to all of it, and I think the questioner wants, what are some policies that might be useful in advocating for more vociferously in this moment? I can say, you know, baby bonds is gaining steam. And so that's a potential one. Keep pushing for Medicare for all. We should have public accounts. We should have public banking. Everybody in the 21st century should have access to a quality account at this day and age. And it would not be so technically difficult beyond our means of implementing or costly to do so. Hell, we're born with a Social Security account. So, you know, people should not have to wait 5 days for their checks to clear and should have a place that they can cash a check without exorbitant fees. That, to me, those are simpler ones that should be done. I mean, I can keep going. Let me get to the point of my answer. These three things are motivating me. It is our government. It is our money. And when I say it is our money, I'm saying that the US government has sovereign monetary power and the ability to pay for things in ways that deficit myth that has been purported and put upon us is a distraction and limiting. If we understand, we just saw with the first two CARES Act that we spent about $4 trillion with relative ease. Is that going to destroy our economy? If we didn't spend it, our economy would be more destroyed. The US government can borrow money at cost, at interest rates that are well below the rate at which we can grow an economy. Inflation has not been a problem for us for a very long time. So we need to get out of that deficit myth that constrains our notion of ability to pay. We just passed that $1 trillion Tax Cut and so-called Jobs Act of Donald Trump and didn't hesitate in spending that money. So we have capacities. In fact, rather than framing deficits as deficits, they should be framed as investments in the American people. The problem is how we spend that money, not our capacity to spend it. If we're spending it in a way to generate more plutocracy with tax cuts, where those at the top are able to accumulate more and more and more, and then further change the rules with their economic power in their favor, that's anti-democratic and problematic. But we can spend it on America's best resource, its people, by forging an economic rights agenda. That promotes shared prosperity. It's going to have spillover benefits to lead to a more dynamic economy. Investing in firms will benefit. If you have workers that where you don't have to worry about the cost of their health, and they're coming to work more productive, that's a benefit to the firm. But let me not misstate, firms don't necessarily want this agenda because they also benefit from keeping wages down when workers are, when work itself is more volatile and you have surplus populations of people, through mass incarceration, through unemployment, et cetera. That also is a mechanism to keep wages down. So, on the one hand, they'd have more productivity from a more productive workforce. On the other hand, they would have to pay higher wages. So it's not necessarily the case that they'll benefit. That's the point I'm making. What else? The answer to when and how we can get these policies is when we seize it. Because it's our money, we can afford to do it, and it's our government. So, when we seize the reins of making sure that the government does their fiduciary responsibility, which is our well-being, that's when we can have this economic rights agenda.
Again, the relationship of policy and politics to economics sounds pretty clear in your response there. What is your position on worker co-ops and cooperative economics in general? I think that's another good question. I think that comes up for me a lot. I'd definitely like to hear what you think about that as well.
Yeah. I think worker co-ops are a good thing. I think they're useful, but I don't believe that they're scalable en masse to solve all our problems. So I support them and hope that we work to facilitate them for various reasons, but it in and of itself needs to be incorporated into a larger package.
Right. Right on. How does, the question I'll just ask it as it's written. How does your analysis of anti-Blackness in politics jive with defensive policies like baby bonds? I fear even if wealth is used as a means test, this would lead to further prosecution of Black informal workers and 1099 contractors, as failure to report income on taxes would become the new welfare queen status. Isn't the accumulation of Black political power a necessary prerequisite to prevent racist application of quote unquote universalist policies? I'm happy to reread any of that if you like. I know there's a lot in there, but I think it's a great question.
Right. So, I'm not in disagreement with the questioner, and I think the questioner is right. And that's why there is no silver bullet policy. And that's why this has to be a whole political economy agenda. Neoliberalism itself is not just economics, it's a political economy. There's politics and economics to that whole neoliberalism. We sure don't practice a pure market economy. Today, we bail out various sectors at will often. We subsidize various sectors at will often. So I agree with the tenet of the question, and also point out why, in the end, we are going to need reparations, because part of that stigma that's ongoing, the narratives of castigating Black people as welfare queens and deadbeat dads, is grounded in a long history by which we're deemed undeserving. And that Truth and Reconciliation of Reparations is intended, at least in part, to remove some of that stigma. So in the end, this has to be politics, economics, as well as the third pillar in the political and economic arrangement that leads to a society that consolidates resources, thinking of race and stratification not as an issue, but as the questioner implied, and I love that question, a third leg in that tripod that props up economics and politics. We need to address race. Race isn't an issue, it is critical. The way Donald Trump came into office was basically codifying a message that codified the property rights and whiteness. It's not a coincidence that he targeted the Latinx population, given all the narratives about America not being a majority minority, and that, first off, demography is not going to save us. Let's make that clear. But the notion that whites would no longer be a numerical majority and that would result from immigration created this straw man for Donald Trump to run on and say, I'm going to build walls to protect your political status. So if we want to understand how policy, economics, and politics work, we also have to consider that the ways in which you get a dominant political class to go along with this system of consolidation is you offer them the property rights and whiteness. You offer them the material and psychological benefits of not being the first fired and the first fired and the last hired. You offer them the dignity of interactions with the police where they'll be treated better than somebody else who's beneath them. Sadly, not only do we care about our vertical position in society, we also care about status, horizontal positioning. And a lot of the privileges of whiteness is about horizontal positioning. So, I'm rambling. I'll say, to put a button on this conversation, that a way to address this, in my view, is to redefine economic well-being. That the neoliberal definition of self-interested accumulation that knows no bounds feeds into a framework where a strong man is able to come along and pit us against each other and offer the dominant class some relative status to say, however unequal you are in our society, at least you're not Mexican. That when they're able to do something like that, right, that vulnerability is from that framing of economic well-being. An alternative framing of economic well-being, which is just as human, just as natural, is an understanding of common humanity, to raise the tribe level to, people, a recognition of sustainability, of dignity, of morality, to ground our understanding of economic well-being and morality. To me, that's the game changer. That is when we can get an economic rights framework where we have the resources for everyone so that they can have self-determination in their life.
Right on. One of the questions that comes up a lot is the circulation of the dollar within communities, and I, for one, think this is often wildly misunderstood. But so I'd like to definitely want to hear your thoughts on this. The question is, what are your thoughts about rotating credit associations and savings when it comes to the Black community and our economic condition?
I thought you were going to ask something else, for which you are no doubt the premier expert on. And hope we get into that as well, which is the notion of can buying Black.
We can fold that in here, but seriously, again, the question is always brought up. This question, as asked here, about the circulating our money. The dollar rotates in other communities more than it does in our own. Why don't we do better with that? And what can be done?
And I was joking with you because we're friends and we've been talking, but I got to take the question is a serious one and should be addressed. So I apologize.
No, that's cool. Yeah, I appreciate it though.
So first off, we need to understand that we are a low resource community. That there is an inadequacy of resources in our community, and we're not an ownership community. And we're not an ownership community because we reject ownership. We're not an ownership community because we have not had the policies historically to facilitate ownership. We're not an ownership community because when we were able to acquire resources and ownership, it was not politically protected from theft, from fraud, and from outright terror. That's why we're not an ownership community. And that's in part why we need truth and reconciliation. With that understanding, I always turn to Ira Katz Nelson, the historian who wrote the book When Affirmative Action Was White, where he describes that a white asset-based community never simply emerged, that it was facilitated by policies that excluded Black people intentionally. So they didn't do it on their own. There's a mythology that there was this self-help group that ever did it on their own without government facilitation. It's just not true, or at least I'm unaware of. I should have the hubris to know that maybe I'm not aware of it. So, with Black people, I think it is symbolically important to support each other and to go to Black businesses. The rotating credit come about in my mind because we don't have adequate access to conventional credit. I mean, in the end, the rotating credits actually lose money. Your money could be drawing interest rather than paying someone to hold your resources. You could, in those ROTAs, you could be drawing interest with a bank if you had a bank that was going to give you prime access to an account. Many of us don't have that. So ROTAs become other alternatives and options because we would otherwise be preyed upon. And that's why we need government to ensure that everybody has access to an account, period, in the 21st century. That should be an economic right. But let me say more. They're also communal, and also, they build community and people enjoy being in those. And if they're, if it psychologically helps somebody to save for a vacation or something like that when they otherwise wouldn't, good. I'm all for those things too, but I guess I'm trying to give the sobering economic reality is that that's not a solution for our economic mobility. Those are important, useful for a variety of dimensions, and I probably would take part in them too because they're just fun to be communal from my perspective because, at this point in my life, I do have access to prime banking. So I wouldn't do it as a strategy to save, but I'm rambling. Let me stop. That's my answer.
No, I mean I appreciate that, and as brother Chris Marshall has said in the chat, it's good to hear from a Black economist this answer. You were on your way to paying me a compliment, and I appreciate it. But my expertise is not in economics. If it's in anything at all, it's in the way media present these issues, and that's where I see a bigger problem. That these are presented so often, particularly to Black audiences, as the solution or as a legit solution to the kind of inequality that you outlined from the beginning, and have talked about throughout this hour as being part of a policy response. So this idea that other people started off in the kinds of same inequality and poverty and just shared money with each other and somehow arose out of poverty. I mean, is the kind of mythology that is promoted that is so dangerous, I think. Anyway, so before I start rambling, when I'm not asked to, let me just keep moving here because the questions are still coming in, and I think that they are really good. We are at the end of the first hour, and I just want to make sure that everybody's that you're still good for at least a few more minutes.
Double check. I'm sorry.
And others. While he's doing that, let me just thank everybody for at least joining this hour and for sending all these great questions. And you let me know if when it's time to stop or if I should start to wrap it up, and we can give you some concluding remarks. We currently have 5 questions here. Some of which may have been answered. I don't know.
I started late, so let's keep going. I got another thing, but I'll be late to it. So we'll go.
Well, we don't want to create the domino effect. Well, the next question is, can modern monetary theory help bridge the racial gap?
Yeah. In that framework of our money, our money, our government, our economy, our money, MMT fits very well with an understanding of our money. So, MMT is useful for many things, but a lot of credit to them for dismissing the myth that government doesn't have capacity.
Okay. There's a question here that dovetails with one of the ones I wanted to ask, so I'm gonna jump to this one. Is your policy recommendations basically making us reliant on white people doing the right thing in terms of changing and creating government policies? And I want to reframe that just a slight bit to ask you specifically to comment on my own idea, that which is similar to that, and I get a lot of personal critique from my beloved reparations community for this. And I'm often misunderstood here. I'm a full advocate for reparations and think Black people in America have a specific history that deserves addressing. But similar to this question here, part of what I've always been concerned with the reparations strategy is that it requires, again, a mass amount of white Americans to use electoral strength or voting power to redistribute wealth in this country just to Black people. And I've always found that tactically to be a struggle to get on board with. So when I've made this broader argument that we should just go after the pre-COVID 20 trillion GDP in this country and say, just develop public policy that redistributes GDP in a way that there is no poverty, that everybody has what you were talking about earlier, free healthcare, access to college and stuff like that. And then within that would be created pockets through which Black people could then on their own specifically address other concerns that white America can't or shouldn't be involved in. In other words, that way we don't have to rely on white and other non-Black people saying we are going to vote for policy specifically for Black people when this country has constantly demonstrated a particular hatred for Black people, making it hard to understand that there would be this kind of voting strength for reparations just for Black people. So if any of that needs to be repeated, let me know. But somewhere in there is a question you can grab onto and give your thoughts on. Yeah.
So let me start with the first one. Am I asking for white people to do the right thing? The way that question's framed leads me to believe that the person is alluding that the government is for white people. Because I'm asking government to do the right thing. And I believe that government needs to be pushed to do the right thing or demanded upon to do the right thing by its people. And by its people includes both Blacks and whites. So I am asking that we reach an anti-racist framework, and by anti-racist, that doesn't mean that we're without race conscious. We can't be without race conscious given our history of deprivation, exploitation, extraction that I've been talking about and you've been talking about. But that we are, in thinking about the resources of government, actively, and here I'll borrow from Ibram Kendi, actively anti-racist. That we are actively trying to ensure that our policies, by design and implementation, don't exclude people based on race. So, white people would have to give up the benefits of white privilege at some point, and that's not an easy ask because, as you know, there are material and psychological benefits of that. But those benefits are not realized if we have a moral economy. With a moral economy, then that those neoliberal norms that I've been talking about, and I'm not going to be redundant, I said it, would have less saliency. So yes, if and I'm being snide, I am asking white people to do the right thing. I'm asking all people to do the right thing. Going back to some of the juxtaposition you put together, Professor Bell, is I think we need
or ball. Just
balls.
it happens all the time. There's something in there. I don't know what it is, but there's something that happens, and even people who know me for years will do. I don't know what it is. There's something about ball that they want to do to Bell, but it's all right, my man. It's all good.
Thank you, brother.
And I hope it's because you were channeling Darrick Bell when you thought of me, the late great, and that's
That was my response when you said Bell and you made that analogy. I just said, well, that's what I'm thinking of. Sorry.
All right, there you go. All right. I'm sorry. Go ahead, man.
So I actually know a Jared Bell, and that's probably the real reason why I did it.
That works too.
So okay, let me get these answers out. Stop long. All right, so I think we need both, and that's the point. That as you point out, even if we need to get a just moral economy, period, that is actively anti-racist, that literally eliminates poverty, that literally provides everyone with access to a debt-free college education, and by making it universal, you get rid of some of those stigmas that become very racialized. I agree with that, and we need to make sure that we are actively anti-racist in implementation. Otherwise, we repeat the mistakes of the past with the New Deal with Social Security excluding domestic and agricultural workers. That said, we also need reparations. And the timing of reparations might not be today, it might not be tomorrow, it might be the next week or the following week. Regardless of when it is, we need to continue on that trajectory and pathway, and we won't get to the end game of a moral economy until we have reparations. And I earnestly believe that we can get to the values where white people need to recognize that they need to redress the sins of what their government did. And last point is, in all this conversation, I keep pointing to the government because there's a public responsibility. So when people even give the anti-reparations arguments of, I came as an immigrant, my family didn't do this, didn't do that, your government did. And your government is responsible. So collectively, the government has to redress reparations. That's where the argument lies.
And at least to partially argue against myself, it has been shown, I might have even read in something you've written, that closing the racial wealth gap, even before the COVID crisis, was seen as such a concern because the inequality was getting to the point where even before COVID, it was seen that I think Black inequality was causing a 2 to 4% lag on GDP. In other words, if you give reparations in some form or package to Black people, it could be argued would spike the overall GDP of the country, as it's been shown, maybe again also in your work, that if we had universal health care, that would benefit Black both income and businesses in particular. I think just several hundred million or billion, something like that, but would be of great help. So in other words, something that would be of help specifically to Black people could also and should be argued also would be a benefit to others as a way of maybe helping them get on board.
That's right. Right. So Citibank, I think, did that study.
Okay.
Closing the racial wealth gap would have all these beneficial effects on the economy. But let me say one thing in response to that. That to me can't be the motivation to do it. That the motivation still has to be grounded in morality, because whether our economy benefits or not, it's immoral for you to do this to us and do it to these people, and that's wrong. And if you were to come up with a counter argument of how an immoral economy could grow an economy, that's not good enough either. For example, slavery grew an economy. Of people can lead to growth. So regardless of whether it grows an economy or not, we should do it. But it's important to know that there's some spillover benefits that can happen as well in our current context. Dramatic spillover benefits if we were to do this.
Listen, Professor Hamilton, I know our time is short. I want to at least give you any time to make any concluding comments you'd like. We'll table our disagreement over the elections for some other time. But no, I seriously, I really appreciate you doing this and sharing with our faculty, staff, students, and those who have joined publicly. and who will see this later, obviously. So unfortunately, we didn't get to all the questions, or I think we got to a good number of them. But any concluding comments that you'd like to have us walk away with?
So my screw up of calling you Bell aside, let me say with full throat, and I mean this, it is an honor and privilege to be here with you, and it gives me joy because I got a whole lot of respect for you, because I've seen your work and seen what you do, and know that it is so grounded from a perspective of justice, where you are willing to speak out and compelled to speak out when you, regardless of whether it benefits you or not in a personal way, because you're so committed to justice. So thank you and respect.
Likewise, I appreciate that. So we'll do a virtual a round of applause that most we can't see and hear. Thank you very much, and really thanks to all who have attended and who will see this later. We appreciate it, and thanks for all your questions, Professor Hamilton. Thanks again, and as always. When I wrap up, as Fred Hampton used to say to you, I say peace if you're willing to fight for it, as I know you are. So peace, Professor Hamilton and everybody else. Thanks again for joining us. Take care.